Language Advocacy Day Canada, February 4th, 2021. #LAD21. A day of language rights, including conference, film festival, town hall, and idea marketplace. Thank you to our coalition partners for making Language Advocacy Day possible.
Now we have our first panel, and I'd like to have a warm welcome to our first conference panel, Reflections on the Indigenous Languages Act. The Indigenous Languages Act was developed with the overall purpose of supporting the efforts of Indigenous peoples to reclaim, revitalize, maintain, and strengthen Indigenous languages. The Act received Royal Assent on June 21st, 2019. The Act indicates that the Government of Canada is committed to providing adequate, sustainable, and long-term funding to achieve the overall objective of reclaiming, revitalizing, maintaining, and strengthening Indigenous languages. In consultations with Indigenous peoples, the panelists will provide an overview of the status of Indigenous languages as well as a critique of the legislation. The moderator of this panel is Lorena Fontaine. Lorena is Cree, Anishinaabe, and a member of the Sac King First Nations in Manitoba. She is the Indigenous Academic Lead and an Associate Professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at the University of Winnipeg. Her PhD research on Aboriginal language rights in Canada was produced in a CBC documentary entitled Undoing Linguicide, which was awarded the 2017 Adrienne Clarkson Award. Her most recent publication, Our Languages Are Sacred, Indigenous Language Rights in Canada, is contained in a collection of essays that reflect the recommendations of Indigenous legal scholars and policy leaders on how Canada can braid together a new legal framework through the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples. Okay, welcome, Lorena. I would like to also welcome our panel. Andrea is a professor at Emeritus at St. Thomas University. She spent most of her career as chair in Native Studies at the university and also established a Native Language Immersion Teacher Training Program and an Adult Immersion Program in Miles-Seat. Amos is director at First Nations Languages at Woodland Center, where he co-founded the Gawaini Mohawk Immersion School System. He was central to the creation of the digital archive of I'm really sorry, I cannot pronounce
Hongwe.
Thank you so much. Ceremony and rituals, the publication of Cayuga Dictionary, and the ongoing restoration of the former Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School. Next is David, and David's area of interest are linguistic rights, particularly Section 23 of the Charter, which guarantees Francophones outside of Quebec the right to educate their children in French in publicly funded schools. Building on an earlier article, David published an article in 2006 arguing that Section 35 can and should be interpreted to include the right of Aboriginal parents to have their children educated in their own languages. Next is Ian. Ian is associate professor in the Department of English at Glendon College and a keen supporter of the Canadian Language Museum. Ian organized an outstanding 3-day colloquium at Glendon on the Indigenous language policy implications of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Canada's Indigenous language policies. Finally is Tim, and Tim is from Bear Clan family of the Mohawk Nation and has a lifelong language learner with experience as Director of Education and the Director of Languages for the Assembly of First Nations and the past presidents and CAO of First Technical Institute. He currently serves as the chair of the International Indigenous Recognition of Prior Learning Collective. Thank you so much. Welcome. We're very, very excited for this panel.
Well, thank you for that introduction. My name's Lorena Fontaine again, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel. Buju, Maigan Gijik and Dishnakaz, Maigan and Dudam, Saging and Donjiba. So I just introduced my Anishinaabe name, which is Wolf Sky Woman. I'm from the Wolf Clan, and Saging is my home community. So I'm very happy to be speaking to you today on this important day. I would like to thank Eliana for inviting us and for all the organizers that have, I know have been working really hard this past week to put on this Language Advocacy Day. I'm also really honored to be speaking with the other panelists. I admire their work greatly, and I'm looking forward to our conversation this morning. Before I ask each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes on the work that they do, and as well as on, on the Indigenous Languages Act, I'm going to briefly provide a bit of background about Indigenous languages in Canada. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indigenous Languages Act, just to provide some context to the conversation this morning. So I'm going to just share my screen here. So this is a map of Indigenous languages spread across Canada. There are approximately 70 to 90 Indigenous languages, original languages in Canada. And it depends on where the stats you go to look at the numbers. So if you go to Stats Canada, they'll say that there are probably over 60 Indigenous languages. UNESCO reports that are closer to 90 Indigenous languages in Canada. Each of these languages have a unique history, culture, and provides a worldview that's unique to Indigenous peoples. They're the cornerstone to our philosophies and our nationhood. These languages are also important because they describe the relationships that we have to one another and as well to our territory, our land. All these languages are currently endangered, and they're endangered in a variety of ways. The declining of these languages are contributing to the fact that these languages are not being spoken at home are contributing to the non-transmission of languages from the aging population that are predominantly fluent speakers to the younger population. It's important to note as well that the state of endangerment varies across the country. So for example, in British Columbia, you might have some communities where they only have 1 or 2 speakers left. If you go up to Nunavut, where they speak Inuktitut, Inuit make up about 80% of the population. And Inuktitut is the public majority language. And yet this language is very much at risk. Every year, the number of speakers decline by 1%. Since the 1940s, First Nations languages have also rapidly been declining from about 90% to 12% speakers. For the Métis people, there's less than 500 speakers left in Canada. And the reason why these languages are endangered is due to Canada's assimilation policies that started in the late 1800s. The government wanted to assimilate Indigenous peoples and also part of the goal was to extinguish the language and culture. This was primarily done in the residential school system, where children were forcibly removed from their communities and their homes, and they were forbidden to speak their own language. This was also, there are a number of Indigenous communities that didn't have residential schools, but have also been impacted because the schools, the medium of instruction became English and French. So schools have done a great deal of damage to Indigenous languages. My parents and grandparents attended these schools. My grandparents didn't speak any English, were forced to attend these schools. And when they came out of the schools, they still refused to speak English to their children because they wanted to make sure that the culture stayed alive. My parents were forced to attend these schools as well. And unfortunately, when they came out of the schools, they felt so much shame that they didn't pass on the language to my generation. So these schools not only did damage to the passing of Indigenous languages from one generation to the next, but they created a lot of shame in our communities speaking the language. And I would argue that our current school system is also contributing to the decline of speakers, of Indigenous language speakers. English or French is the medium of instruction in most schools across Canada. And there are very little opportunities for Indigenous children to learn their language and culture in school, in the K-12 system, as well as in the post-secondary institutions. Because of this history, Indigenous languages have been ignored, stigmatized, replaced, or displaced in Canada. I would also emphasize that post-secondary institutions and the school system K-12 are critical for language revitalization, as well as early childhood programs. Currently, the homes are not, our home communities are not passing on the language because of this history. And schools are going to play a critical component in the revitalization of Indigenous languages. So I'm going to just cover the bare bones of the Indigenous Languages Act, and the panelists, I think, are going to provide a bit more detail, critiquing the legislation, as well as talking about some of their work in this area. So in 2019, the House of Commons introduced the Indigenous Languages Act by the Minister of Canadian Heritage and Multiculturalism. The Act was supposed to be co-developed by the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, the leaders of these different Indigenous communities. And the legislation received Royal Assent on June 21st, 2019. There are really three main areas to the Indigenous Languages Act. The first one recognizes the rights related to Indigenous languages as Aboriginal and treaty rights affirmed and recognized under Section 35. And I know the panelists are going to have a number of things to say about this, this clause. Section 7 to 10 talk about the fact that the minister can create agreements with provincial, territorial, and Indigenous governments regarding Indigenous language rights. And then the third main area of the legislation looks at the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages, clauses 12 to 44. The Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages has 5 main mandates, which consist of promoting Indigenous languages, supporting Indigenous peoples to reclaim and maintain Indigenous languages, and they're also supposed to facilitate dispute of resolutions that come out of the Indigenous Languages Act, support any new technologies that will support the revitalization of Indigenous languages, and promote public awareness. So I'm just going to end the slide here. So that is just to provide a bit of context to the legislation, as well as to provide a bit of context to the Indigenous Languages Act. And I'm going to now ask the panel members to briefly talk about their work and also any reflections that they have, critiques on the Indigenous Languages Act. And I'm going to ask Andrea Bear-Nicholas to begin.
Liwen Lorena, Nagaye, Nalita Hauseli, Abachimin, Ktlewa Millennia. I thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a struggle for most of my life, but over the last 25 years, it's really become the main focus of my life. I wanted to give a short discussion about my own experience. I became chair in Native Studies at St. Thomas University in 1993. Just prior to that, I had heard Dorothy Lazor, one of the founders, if not the founder of the Mohawk Immersion School at Kahnawake. And I instantly knew that immersion education in our languages was the answer to saving or stopping the decline of our languages. I instantly became an advocate for that idea, began inviting Dorothy to New Brunswick to talk to our teachers who were also speakers, but who were actually teaching only in English. I think we made some inroads because we had a seminar in 1996 which she basically conducted. And we had a few schools start immediately with some immersion programming. But we found that the support was missing in the communities, that even though parents perhaps wanted it, there wasn't enough support for these teachers. And in fact, these programs really needed a good influx of funding so that they could develop curriculum, so that they could develop or keep training teachers to be teaching in immersion, because we realized that it wasn't just enough to be able to speak one's language. One needed to have the techniques and the skills for teaching through immersion. So St. Thomas University thankfully allowed me to work with Dorothy Lazor to develop a native language immersion teacher training program, which in the end, it got accepted by Maritime Provinces Higher Education Commission as an official certified program of 13 courses. And we actually trained teachers, a small cohort of teachers from 2 communities that now have very successful immersion programs. One is Eskasoni and the other is Listigouche in Quebec. That was wonderful, and it worked primarily because we had, in those communities, had a fairly large group of speakers who were also teachers. Smaller communities not have the capacity to do that, and we've been struggling ever since. Even in my own community, which is probably the best community for developing this kind of program, there's been opposition or at least indifference to doing immersion. Parents have wanted it, but we haven't had the support to move on it. I would say that, well, I realized about 2009 that we needed to start another program, and that would be an adult immersion program, thinking that maybe if we could use that to promote an awareness and a revitalization of our languages. That has worked somewhat, but it still hasn't been effective. And I relate all this to point out that I realized ever since about 2005, when we had a conference, we invited Tove Skudnab Kangas to be our keynote speaker, along with her husband and David Leach and Dorothy Lazor. And we invited 20 representatives from about 20 immersion schools across Canada to this conference. It was probably the first ever conference on immersion. And it is from that conference that David and I and others, including Amos and eventually Lorena joined us, to start advocating or keep advocating for the right to our schools in our language. We really see this as the major failing of the legislation. We were shocked that it didn't happen to be part of the legislation. We pushed and we pushed, making presentations everywhere we could for the last 15 years, actually, and still it didn't show up in the legislation. And we really have no explanation for that other than the idea that our people, some of our leaders have been so indoctrinated into thinking that money is the only answer, into not realizing that we do not have basically the same rights as Anglophones and Francophones in Canada. And basically it makes us second or third class citizens in this country. And we just feel that we have a lot of work to do on this matter. In fact, I'd say that lack of education for our teachers, for our people about our linguistic rights is one of the failings of our education systems. Also, I got involved in this work, and I forgot to mention this because my initial interest had been the history of our people. And I realized that if we lose our languages, and we're not really losing it, it is being destroyed. It's not just a case of inaction around our languages, but as Tove Skudnab-Keng has argued, the imposition of schooling in a dominant language is actually destructive of our Indigenous languages, especially where there is no option for an education in our own language. And as I said, there were at least 20 communities, First Nations across the country that had Indigenous language, or that were using Indigenous languages as their medium of instruction. That number has grown somewhat, but those are very difficult projects in those communities because it means bake sales and car washes and raising money to keep them going. Many of them have faltered for lack of funding. So again, the issue really is until we have the right to education in our language, as your first speaker this morning pointed out, I believe our languages are going to not just decline, but are going to disappear, at least most of them. My language is one that as of 5 years ago, we estimated it had about 10 years to be viable, to be able to institute an immersion program in our communities. Right now, we have some communities with no speakers and other communities with so few speakers and so elderly speakers that they really don't have the option to continue or to implement immersion. So my community is really the key. The parents are supportive, but we are still hoping that the right to education in our language will become a reality. And I don't think we've got much hope unless that happens. And I would end by saying, if the government would spend at least half of what it spent on destroying our languages, I think we would have hope. And as I said, it's not just a matter of funding, but funding is what will become available if we can make sure that we have a right to our languages as the medium of instruction in our schools. I'm not sure where my time is on this, but I will leave it at that and give more time to the other speakers.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Thank you for that. I think it's important to note at the beginning of the morning, we did see a video on the Official Languages Act. So children have a right to be educated in French or English in Canada, and that right does not transfer to Indigenous peoples right now, and yet we have legislation that is supposed to protect Indigenous languages. That legislation was created because of the assimilation policies and the impact of the residential schools. And so I think that, you know, when we're talking about Advocacy Day for languages, we really need to look at what's happened to the first languages in this country. And I was just surprised, well, not surprised, but I was thinking about what you had just said, Andrea, about the fact that there are some people having bake sales to support some of these language programs, and yet there are children that are able to go to school in French or English. It's publicly funded, and they don't have to worry about raising money to teach children in those languages. So I'm going to go on to the next speaker, Amos. Oh, you have to unmute yourself.
Program. Scanner Swagwego. Taiho's Nick was Gasso Nanto Aknogre Nan Shwagan. Ye can win Zange. Ganya Danny and work a shout then. Ganyan killed and it was sound Danny was Nanto Hon Aknogre. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amos Key Jr. That's my English name. Excuse me. My traditional name is Taihomas, and it translates as he works with words. I had no decision in that name. It was given to me by our faith keepers and our elders of our clan in a big ceremony when I was a baby. And for some reason, I followed that road to work in languages. But anyway, I live here at Ashwaubenon. I said Six Nations in southern Ontario. I'm from the Turtle clan of my mother, and I'm from her nation, the Mohawk Nation. But my mother and father were quadrilingual plus English. So for some reason, they didn't raise us in their mother tongues, but they raised us in the Cayuga language. And maybe they seen the forefront that Cayuga would end up being the language of our spirituality. And it has been that at Six Nations. So maybe they foresaw that, I don't know. But they raised all of us, all my siblings in the Cayuga language, even though I'm a Mohawk and my dad was an Onondaga. So that's a little bit about my background. We'll talk about the Bill C-91 later, I guess, in the next round. But here at Ashwaubenon, Six Nations, we have about 29,000 people on our roll here, our band roll, and about 16,000 live in a community. So we have some good numbers to work with. And when I came to the Woodland Cultural Center that was established in 1970, as a result of the closing of the Mohawk Institute Residential School, it was converted into a cultural center through the Department of Canadian Heritage and Indian Affairs through the Cultural Centers program. Anyway, and then I came after teaching with the London Board of Education. I came to Woodland some 36 years ago, and I stayed there for 35 years, basically, working in languages. The first thing that was on my desk was to look at piloting a Cayuga language kindergarten. And that resulted out of a symposium that was held in Sudbury, Ontario, by one of the cultural centers on Manitoulin. And they broke up into caucus groups based on, I go back to the civilizations of this province. The Muskego Cree were in one group, the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe people were in another group, and my people, the Ongwahome, were in another group. And the recommendation from our caucus group, the Haudenosaunee Ongwahome people, was to look at immersion education. So that was on my plate when I entered Woodland 35 years ago to establish a kindergarten. And what happened there was because we had the Mohawk language here as well, the Mohawk community as well wanted to be involved with the kickoff of a kindergarten pilot program. So we developed two kindergarten programs, one for Cayuga and Mohawk in immersion. We found some confident, qualified speakers of the language. Incidentally, our first teachers went back to school and they got their credentials after. So, but they threw their hat in the ring. I was able to convince them to leave their full-time positions without a guarantee of a salary. And we had no tuition agreement. We just wanted to do it. And we had to lobby our own elected council, the Department of Indian Affairs, and ourselves. But in our ourselves category were the parents. And I think if any community is going to look at immersion education, because we're so colonized in our communities right now that English is better, you really need to get the parents on side. And our parents became civilly disobedient, like they did in Kahnawake with Dorothy Lazor's school. They actually walked out of the Chateauguay High School when whatever that bill was that was introduced in Quebec. So that's what they did, and we had to do the same thing. And everybody started to jump around. Indian Affairs, the Ministry of Education didn't know what we were doing here. How could the parents keep their students out of school in September? But the parents persevered, and they made the press. They used their own voices to say we want immersion education. So that was great. I mean, Woodlands was the conduit for it. And we negotiated with the Department of Indian Affairs for a tuition agreement for the schools. We finally paid our teachers after 3 months. They weren't paid, but they were convinced as well with the passion that they had that their language was important. The parents raised money for them to give them at least some grocery money each week. So that's what the parents did. Again, nickel and diming it and having fundraisers. That's what they did. For the schools, our veterans loaned us their Legion Hall for the Cayuga language kindergarten. And each day, my sister, who was our first kindergarten teacher, had to clear the beer bottles and ashtrays every morning with the parents to make a classroom for kindergarten. That was a veterans donation to the school system. And then we refurbished one of the old schools that were put out of service on the reserve, a neighborhood school. And the Mohawk parents cleaned up that school as well, washed the floors, all that kind of stuff. And we had no furniture in that school, so we had to they had to go and buy pails at the hardware store so the kids would have something to sit on. So we remember all of this. It's a big story, and it's a beautiful story about where we came from. And now we have Gawaneo is the name of the school. It means the beautiful sounds. It now has, it goes from kindergarten to grade 12. And early on, when we first had our first grade 12 cohort, we watched them for the next 2 or 3 years, and we were happy to say and write up a report that only 2% of those students were on social assistance after grade 12. Everybody else went on to post-secondary education, were employed or self-employed. And that's what you want for your society. Yet we are given all of these roadblocks and hurdles to jump over that, even in our own community, we're so colonized that some of the people were saying to us, they're just going to teach them nothing but witchcraft there at our school. So you have that. That's what I'm saying. I think we need to do some research about our own decolonization in our communities. What does that look like? We need to look at using terms like what is the research in and the confidence that someone gets in being bilingual. So we need to do some research, the benefits of being bilingual, because that's where we are in our communities, predominantly English speakers. And now we want to look at bringing back our mother tongue. We really need to work with our communities to look at immersion, not immersion education, but bilingual education. Because regardless, you still have to look at being bilingual in this community. The French have a head start on us, but I think we can use some of that research for our own research about our continuity and our the attributes and traits of our civilizations, and show that to our young people and to our communities that these are the benefits of being bilingual in this country, Indigenous bilingualism. I know that's not in the act as well, and no language like that is in there at all. So I think that's what for us going forward, I think that's one of the things that we need to do is we need to decolonize in our own communities, and then do some real Indigenous ways of knowing research for our own Indigenous bilingualism. And I think we need to start using labels, decolonizing some of the labels that were used as well with us. And one of them is the term culture. I know Ian Martin hears me ad nauseum talk about that in our meetings. Instead of using the label culture, we don't live in a culture. We live in civilizations, Indigenous civilizations, and they have all the traits and characteristics of any civilization in the world. And my proof to myself and my ways of knowing is that the Anishinaabe have the Three Fires Confederacy. The Ongwehome, my people, have the Six Nations Confederacy, and those are democracies. And you cannot have a democracy if you're not civilized. So we are civilized. It's much more than a culture. And that's some of my soapbox speeches I give in my lectures at university level. And the students get it. Students from around the world that were in my classes, they got the point that we aren't just a culture. Hockey is a culture in this country, yet they'll say Indigenous culture. When government writes about us, sometimes even academics, when they write about us, will say Indigenous culture as a label. And we got to move that shackle. If we're going to go to our own emancipation as Indigenous people in this country, we got to get rid of those labels and take on the label where we rightly stand as having civilizations in this country. So I'm going to stop there because I'm going to go on, and if I don't. So can I just say one more thing? The other thing in my research, we got to include our linguistic rights, or even just our bilingualism as a health determinant. We've got to include that when our researchers are talking about social and health determinants. We've got to include our linguistic rights, our linguistic background as one of the social determinants of a healthy Indigenous community. Donito, that's it for now.
Thank you, Amos. I think some of the things that we're hearing this morning are really important when we look at the legislation itself. So Andrea was talking about the emphasis on education, that we need our kids in school learning the language, and the struggles that we face in educating our children in our Indigenous languages. And I'm always, I love hearing Amos speak. And I didn't know about that history of the immersion programs in your community. But what it said to me is that the people do really value and love the language. But oftentimes we do face struggles with our parents, with the parents in our communities that have been so colonized, assimilated, and by thinking that our languages don't have value. And they do. We know that they do. And I know that people that are listening here today understand the value of speaking your mother tongue. So I'm going to ask Tim to speak next.
Welcome to Greetings, everybody. My name is Gertie Huguero. I also go by Tim. I come from a Bear Clan family here in Wahtemohawk territory, which is south central Ontario. Our people moved here back around 1881 after facing oppression in Gannessadage area right next to the town of Oka, Quebec. There was a struggle for land rights that continues to happen today. It's been going on for well over 200 years. Some of the people came over here to be free from the oppression over there. So we continue to, those who moved here continue to live here today. We our home language is Mohawk language, related to language to the language Amos was speaking, Cayuga. That's they're related Haudenosaunee languages. In my lifetime, I've been fortunate to work with a number of Indigenous organizations, primarily in the area of education and languages. In order to work in the area of Indigenous languages and Indigenous education, you cannot avoid an examination of our history. If you're working in any way with governments in Canada, whether it's the federal government or provincial governments or even municipal governments, the history of policy and legislation towards Indigenous people needs to be understood, needs to be examined, it needs to be assessed in how it has evolved to the present day. In terms of language, our languages came under formal assault through policy and legislative means. In the mid-1800s, a system of residential schools was established, purportedly to provide us with new types of skills and knowledge to exist in an emerging in a new emerging economy in Canada. But underlying that stated theme was the idea that we needed to be civilized. And so these schools were put under the authority of various church groups who proceeded to focus on removing the key parts of our identities, including our languages. This effort became accelerated in the 1920s and into the 1930s. Here in my community, we had over 40 people who were taken to residential schools, including 10 from my family. And at those schools, they weren't allowed to speak their language. They were punished for it. If you go across the country from the East Coast to the West Coast and up to the far north, they will tell you stories about what happened in those schools if they spoke their languages. Everything from whippings to isolation to being pricked on the tongue with pins, anything to shame the people into not speaking their languages, anything to tell them that their languages were not a good thing. And it was in addition to other measures that occurred, measures such as the erasure of our histories, the demonization of our cultural practices, anything to erase our identities and to remake us into something else. We carry that history. Governments carry that history. Policymakers carry that history. In the mid-90s, I should go back just a little bit. By the 1970s, there was a movement to have First Nation schools on reserve. The idea was that our schools could better teach the things that we believed our future generations would require, including our languages and cultural ways. But the policymakers did not provide the necessary support for that to occur. So as the number of schools grew across the country, upwards of 500 of them in First Nations communities, the policy supports and the funding that they would require didn't grow. And in fact, caps were put on the funding. By 1996, relatively recently, only 25 years ago, a permanent cap was placed on the funding for First Nation schools so that increases could not grow by more than 2% a year. Schools were required to deliver a curriculum equivalent to that offered by the provincial jurisdiction. There were very few teaching programs in place that would enable language teachers to become teachers of other subjects in those schools. So there's real lack of infrastructure support, policy support, resource support for the schools. We have fought that for decades. Only now are we seeing some signs of temporary change. At the same time, we advocated for change in the recognition of our languages. We're looking for some kind of formal support in the same way as the official languages in this country. After decades of action, we ended up with something called the Indigenous Languages Act. It received Royal Assent 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, in 2019. And when we looked at it, we saw a lot of nice words. We see a preamble that tells us that our languages are valued, that says that our languages need support, and that there's a role for policymakers and others to provide that support. But when we looked at the text of the legislation, we found that there was nothing enforceable to make that happen. And so we have to try to find a way forward. We have to take the provisions of the law that have been put in place and say, we like the nice words, but we need to do more. We still require the formal recognition. We still require the acknowledgement that our languages are important and that they comprise a right that our people have to be educated in our languages. And so we need to press forward on those issues. I think our issues are unique in places where Indigenous people reside around the world, which means when we go to the United States, our people struggle for recognition of their right to be educated in their languages and for the support required to support their languages. When we go to Central America, we find Indigenous people continuing to fight for the recognition of their right to speak their languages and to maintain them. In South America, throughout Polynesia, as we go into other parts of the world, there's a push by Indigenous people to struggle to gain recognition of their right to speak their languages, to be educated in them, and to have full communication in our languages. We find unity in our struggles, even though we face sometimes different circumstances in our different countries. I want to acknowledge those who have created this forum. Language Advocacy Day is important. We know that language conveys the spirit of our humanity, of our shared humanity. It inspires us. When we hear people speaking different languages, we know they're carrying knowledge that can help us in our journeys here. We know that through sharing that knowledge that's conveyed through our languages, that we can learn from each other, that we can help one another. And that's always a good thing. So congratulations to those who have created this forum. I want to acknowledge your aspirations and also acknowledge the keynote speaker today for a wonderful keynote.
Thank you, Tim, for that really important historical overview of Indigenous languages in Canada, but also to bring, to shed light on the fact that Indigenous languages around the world are all endangered, and we do share a similar history for the demise of our languages, and we all face an uphill battle in the education system to have our languages taught in schools. But that all languages are critical, that when we speak our languages, we, as you said, we share a shared humanity. And I think those are all really important in light of what we're speaking about today. I'm going to ask David Leach to speak next.
Hello, everyone. I've unmuted myself. Am I being heard? Yes? Okay, so it's a hard act to follow the speakers you've already heard. I am not an Aboriginal person. I have not experienced what the previous speakers have experienced. But I can tell you that I have a story that intersects with their story. I wanted to be bilingual. For me, that meant English and French. And I had 2 children, and I decided, I was already speaking some French, that I would try to get them into one of the schools that provide, not immersion schools that run completely in French. The janitors speak French, everything's in French. So I went and got them into this school, a Catholic school in Toronto, and they are now bilingual. My son is a lawyer. He went to law school in French. My other son is a journalist. He speaks French all the time. He works for CBC. So I knew when I was doing all this that it was going to be important for them to have that language skill. But I'm a lawyer, so I started to think about, well, how is this that I have this right as a Canadian person to have my children become completely fluent in this wonderful language, which is French. And the original languages of Canada, it wasn't Canada at the time. The original languages of this country, of this space in the world, are not taught in school. In fact, of course, I learned, as we all did, about the residential school experience that you heard about. So I was motivated to think about it as a lawyer and to think about, is this true? Is this, in fact, the law of Canada? And it's very interesting because the guy who's the Prime Minister of Canada now had a father who was the Prime Minister of Canada at the time when I was thinking about all this stuff. And I was thinking, they must get it. They must know the importance of language. That's why they were fighting for French, because they understand that that's their culture and language. or civilization in language are linked. But no, when Trudeau was the first Trudeau was prime minister, he only gave or created through the Constitution. I mean, he didn't give them anything, but he recognized, because the languages, he didn't create the languages, but he recognized that French was a language of Canada and that should be taught in school to at public expense to children like mine. But at the same time as he was, and really that was the main focus of the charter back in 1982. I mean, everything else that's in the charter, you know, it's not really new. None of it was new. What Pierre Trudeau wanted was to put French on an equal footing with English in Canada through the Official Languages Act that you've heard about, but more importantly through the charter, because the charter gave or recognized the right of francophones to have their children educated in schools where French was the language of instruction. So he made this, at the same time that he was doing this, he was, you know, the white paper came out, Jean Chrétien came out with the white paper, you know, we could just do away with all these Indian people and all their treaties and all this other stuff. He wasn't getting it at all. I mean, he just, you know, a lot of people speak very fondly of Pierre Trudeau, and he did some good things, including French language instruction is a good thing, but nothing, totally dismissive, like not only dismissive, but destructive, as Andrea always says. But what he did was he was put under pressure by Aboriginal people or Indigenous people, whatever word you want to pick, to put something in the damn charter for the Indian people of Canada, the Native people of Canada, the Métis, the Inuits. So he put in section 35 of it's not in the charter, it's in the same package of constitutional amendments. And it said, Canada, it's very simple what it says. It says Canada recognizes and affirms the rights that are given, that are part of either the treaty obligations that Canada entered into, or something called Aboriginal rights. Aboriginal rights, nobody knew quite what that meant in 1982, and frankly, probably most people didn't have. Well, as a lawyer, we referred to Section 35 for a long time as a sort of a black box. We didn't know what was in there. So there was a guy, a very important guy, who's now a very important guy at the UN, and Jean Advocacy. He was the first guy who started taking a look at Section 35 in terms of its ability to provide a basis for language rights for Aboriginal Indigenous peoples. And he sketched out an argument, which I read an article he wrote back in the early 90s, I think. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. And then I started doing some additional work, because after he wrote that article, the courts, the Supreme Court of Canada, started to tell us what Section 35 meant. And what the Supreme Court of Canada said was, Section 35 is in the Constitution to protect the customs, practices, and traditions that existed in Canada prior to Canada being taken over by then England, prior to the assertion of sovereignty, they call it. That, you know, England asserted that they had Canada as part of their, you know, the British realm. So this section was apparently intended to preserve and protect the languages, not the language, it didn't specify languages, the customs, practices, and traditions. Well, you think about that. What does that mean? You know, I hate to use the word, but I mean, everybody knows that you can't have customs, practices, and traditions of any civilization without a language. Language is the key to the whole thing. People have to talk to each other to create customs, practices, and traditions. They have to have a language. And in order for those traditions to carry on, they have to teach that language to their kids. So, I just put Fernando Varen's original article about the possibility of this argument together with the Supreme Court of Canada decision and said, yes, Section 35 is a foundation, a legal foundation for language rights, which will do, said the Supreme Court of Canada, what Section 35 was supposed to do, preserve those customs, practices, and traditions. Means preserve those languages, and they can only be preserved if they're taught to children. And then there were some additional arguments I made about how that means taught to children in publicly funded schools in this new sovereign nation of Canada. And to me, the argument seems so straightforward that I just started, I went to that conference in 2005 that Andrew was talking about, where I met Andrew. And, I just said, you've already got the right, it's already there. And, I think that there was a good deal of shock and amazement in the room. I remember Ruth Norton saying, what the heck? We're told now we already have the right? Well, then I started to try to pull together a lawsuit so that we could go to court to establish that I was right about this, probably, hopefully. The problem with lawsuits, believe me, I've done them, is that they cost an enormous amount of money, they take an enormous amount of time, and you have to be able to, you have to put the fate of this, what you're arguing for, in the hands of some judge. So then I have to go to appeal, and then you have to go to another appeal. I mean, the thing is just so frightening, drawn out, and expensive that I tried to encourage some bands that I knew that I was dealing with, to bring a case, but I couldn't. So then finally, Justin Trudeau is elected, and he says, like a good Quebecer should, I get it, I know the importance of language. I'm going to do something about this question of Indigenous Aboriginal languages. I'm going to pass a law. And I think all of us, because we all knew each other then, people on this panel, we all were hopeful that this would be something good, that it would perhaps even, I'm flattering myself here, but might actually sort of put in the law the argument that I was working on. The Section 35 does give the right to educate children in their own language. Didn't do it. He dropped the ball. Now, we could talk for a while, if you like, about, and by the way, I hope we do get the question, why did he drop the ball? Well, he had a lot of people who helped him fumble the ball along the way. A lot of people, as Andrew was saying, thinking, well, if we get some money from the government for languages, that'll be enough and we won't have to insist on it, right? This was a monumental mistake because we live in a society where rights are what it's all about. People have rights so that they can challenge government decisions. That's why people have rights. If you don't have rights, you are at the mercy of the bureaucrats. That's just like, you don't need to be a lawyer to know that. But somehow there wasn't, there were people, they found enough people, basically allies, to say, this is a great law because what it does, the act, is it says, Section 35 includes language rights. That's the full extent of the significance of this bill, is that it just says, Section 35 includes rights related to language. Well, what's rights related to language? How about the same right the Francophones have to educate their children in their own languages? How about that? Is that what you mean? And if that's what you mean, why don't you damn well say it so that we know, and so that we then have meaningful rights that we can, and I say we, I'm not an Aboriginal person, to exercise. I don't know, to me it was pretty obvious that they knew what they were doing because Canada has a long history of creating language rights. We know how to create language rights in Canada. We've done it. even before Trudeau #1, we were, there were examples of language rights in order to accommodate Quebec, right back to 1867. Do we know how to create language rights? Canada is probably the leading country in the world in how to legalize, enforce language rights. We have the Charter now, but we had the Official Languages Act before that, and we had the Constitution Act of 1867 before. So they obviously knew how to do it, but they didn't do it. So as Tim says, where do we go from here? Well, we have some ideas, a bunch of us this morning, about where to go next. And we're working on those ideas, and we'll keep it posted. Maybe we'll participate in the next annual Language Advocacy Day and tell you about that in more detail. We're still working on it. But I don't want to sound pessimistic. I think the people that you've heard from are the most important people in Canada already. We're working together. We're not that old that we're going to give up. We've been doing this for a while, but I think we're going to keep on, and hopefully we'll have something good to report.
Well, thank you, David, for providing us that critique about the Languages Act and about the fact that Canada does know how to recognize language rights. They've done it since they implemented the Official Languages Act, and that there is an inequality here. When you look at the way the legislation reads for Indigenous languages, we have language rights that recognizes French, English, minority languages, and children have a right to be educated in the languages. And then when you compare what the legislation says in the Indigenous Languages Act, it's again, as David mentioned, a black box. What kind of language rights do Indigenous people have in the legislation? Anyways, there is lots more to talk about the legislation, and there's still a lot more work to be done. So I'm going to hand it over now to Ian.
Am I hearable or am I muted?
Perfect.
I'm good. So welcome to everybody in the town, in the land of the beautiful lake, in the land of the Great Spirit, in the place where logs cross over a river to make a fish weir, and of course, the city of muddy water. So I've said hello to people who live in Canada, Ontario, Manitoba, Toronto, and Winnipeg, and everywhere else. It's a wonderful day, and I think that we're going to take a lot of energy in our future language advocacy from listening to, yes, language advocates, but has come up in this panel, the great contrast between what happens with official languages and what happens with Indigenous languages. So I have 10 takeaways on the Act, on Bill C-91. You've heard from Lorena what it does. You've heard also that it was introduced in the House of Commons in February 2019, and in the ensuing months, February to June, it was discussed in the House of Commons and the Senate, and then it was finally passed into law in June 2019. My work has been primarily looking at the origin of that act, the creation story of that act. And really it is a story of advocacy. It's a story of advocacy, I would say, not listened to. So my 10 takeaways are the following. I have 4 sort of positive takeaways and 6 not so positive takeaways. The first takeaway is that there is now federal legislation. Before 2019, there wasn't. Unlike most of the countries in the hemisphere, Canada came to the table with federal legislation late in the game. It has resisted this for all these 150 and plus years, but it finally was required by the Truth and Reconciliation and by previous advocacy to bring in a piece of federal legislation, which makes now the two constitutionally recognized language categories, official languages on one side, indigenous languages on the other, each now with two types of recognition that no other language in Canada has. Both have constitutional mention, constitutional recognition, and both now have legislative recognition at the federal level. The advantage that French has, by the way, now is that it has legislation in its homeland, in its territory, where it is the majority language. I'm talking about Quebec. And my position on this, by the way, is that, and having worked with the Inuit now for 20 years, the Inuit have looked very, very carefully, not so much at Canada, but they've looked at Quebec, because the percentage of Inuit in Nunavut, for example, is approximately the same, 80 to 85% speakers of Inuktitut. Ditto in Quebec, about 85% of the population of Quebec is Francophone. And why are the Inuit not able to have their own Bill 101 guaranteeing education in Inuktitut on their own territory, whereas the Francophones with Bill 101 have that right? My second point, my second takeaway, there will be an official languages commissioner. Hopefully, one of the people that you're seeing on your screen right now will be accepted. Not saying who it is, but he's southwest of me on the screen. That person will be a national advocate for Indigenous languages. We would spend a long time talking about the weakness of that position comparable to the official languages commissioner. Not only because, as what David said, the official languages commissioner, his job is to, or her job, their job is to uphold the rights of the Official Languages Act. That is not actually what the Indigenous Language Commissioner can do, because there are no rights to uphold in the Indigenous Languages Act. Third takeaway, there has been more public advocacy and public awareness around Indigenous languages now than ever before. Not a week goes by without something appearing in the mainstream media on Indigenous languages, whether an artist is winning an award, whether a film has been produced in Haida, whether there is a powwow in which languages are celebrated, another university has added another level of whatever. Thanks to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the advocacy that led to that commission and the advocacy that has continued after that commission, I think that Canadian civil society is aware, as it has never been before, of the importance of Indigenous languages and the lack of Indigenous language rights. And I think that what we're hearing today actually has the majority support of Canadians. Third, my fourth point is that thanks to this act, the Indigenous Languages Act, we have a clear difference between the federal legislation on Indigenous languages and federal legislation on official languages. And the Indigenous Languages Commissioner every year is going to make a report. And every year, I believe, if that commissioner is doing their job, we're going to hear about those gaps. Gaps in funding, gaps in rights, gaps in prestige. And that is going to remind the Parliament and Canadians in general that work still needs to be done. And that commissioner, even though his rights are very constrained compared to his role is very constrained, finally there is a single figure in Canada, something maybe like a Cindy Blackstock for Indigenous children's rights. It's possible that that person, although with very short leash, from the Department of Canadian Heritage. It's possible that that person could be the focus of national discussions around continued Canadian mistreatment of Indigenous language and the lack of rights thereby. My fifth takeaway, now we begin the minus side. The minus side is actually pretty serious, because after the announcement by the federal government that they were intending to bring in this act, the Minister of Canadian Heritage, who in those days was Daniel Joly, finally met with the three leaders of the national Indigenous organizations. So anyway, the leader of the Métis, Nathan Obed of ITK, and Perry Bellegarde of AFN, and they agreed in June 2017 on 6 principles that would guide their famous co-development. Here are the 6 principles. It must be distinction-based. In other words, commissioners for each of the 3 major groups, not one commissioner for all. 2, emphasize the relationship to land and governance of Indigenous nations. Number 3, full acknowledgement of the harms done under colonialism and the responsibility of the government and the Crown to uphold its honor by, as Andrea suggested, beginning maybe to think of spending half of what it took to destroy languages. They could look at the reparations that would be appropriate to restoring languages. Number 4, full acknowledgement of Indigenous language rights as inherent Aboriginal rights, treaty rights, enforceable in the courts. Another, Indigenous controlled education systems, no matter where Indigenous children are, or adults if they want to learn their language, on or off reserve. No mention of negotiating with provinces or territories to have that right ensured. It was Crown, Indigenous, that's it. And 5, the importance of adequate funding for regional infrastructures to support local efforts. What I discovered in my research, none of these agreed upon starting conditions were met to the satisfaction of the Indigenous participants. The federal government, during its engagement period from 2017 to 2019, didn't live up to any one of the principles agreed between Minister Joly and the 3 representatives of the national Indigenous organizations. As you may know, the Inuit were completely left out in the cold. Why? They were asking for too much, said the minister, a new minister, Rodriguez. They actually wanted federal services offered in their own majority language, Inuktitut, on their territory, Inuit Nunangat. And that was too much for the federal government to allow. Because if the federal government gave the Inuit what they were asking, like access to public services in their language, they might have to actually live up to that in other groups, if and when other groups ask for that to happen. Point number 6, and this is the saddest point, and it goes to exactly what Andrea says and what everyone else has said. All of the representatives from Indigenous organizations advocating for content in this act spoke about the urgency of setting up the right to education in immersion or bilingualism or whatever the nation wished at federal government expense, honoring their fiduciary duty. If you look carefully at the act, the word education is not mentioned. And I found out why, and I think I've told Andrea, but I'm going to tell everyone. Originally, when Joly was minister, the Department of Canadian Heritage was supposed to be the lead ministry of 3 ministries, really of 2 ministries or 3 ministries. Carolyn Bennett's ministry, the Crown Indigenous Relations Ministry, which deals with UNDRIP. It deals with Crown Indigenous Relations, of course, and it also deals with what they call I think they used to call it Indian, but Indigenous Government and Nation Restoration. Okay, those two other ministries never met. There was never any cross-ministry working group to develop this act. So the ministry responsible for Indigenous education, now it's Mark Miller's ministry, Indigenous Services, never actually sat down with the people in Heritage developing the act, and it was left out. And it was left out despite all the advocacy. Think about that. The speculation is because they didn't want to offend provinces, because provinces allegedly have the constitutional right to mount education programs for Indigenous people off reserve. So there's no mention of educational rights. Point number 7, there's no enforceability of any right, as David has said. Number 8, there's no infrastructure to support local efforts. So for example, the situation in British Columbia, which is actually very good, lots of nice infrastructure through the First Peoples Congress, none of that has happened, and no other province has stepped up really to support that. Nova Scotia may be another exception. They have a nice network for the Mi'kmaq, but other than those two provinces, nothing is happening. Number 9, no clear definition of what Indigenous government bodies means, and no clear understanding of how federal finances flow. The federal government seems to say the provinces and the territories must agree to any Crown Indigenous relationship. That's not something that any of the Indigenous groups asked for, and usually the provinces get in the way of federal Indigenous relations. And number 10, my analysis of the many briefs brought before the committees of the House of Commons and the Senate, the best advocacy in Canadian history by Indigenous people to the government with briefs and videotaped representations. It's all there for people to study. There are 2 categories that the Indigenous people came forward with as the serious critiques of this act. Number 1 is no mention of enforceable rights. And the second is that they got the complete Canada Indigenous relationship wrong. And therefore, we may have hope that there will be improvements in the future. But that second critique, the fact that the government, and Murray Sinclair has said this recently, they don't actually know how to relate to Indigenous Canada. And the framework that the government wanted to put in, an overarching piece of legislation called the Rights Framework, came crashing down in 2018 with Judy Wilson-Raybould's flameout, I guess we can say. And the result was that all the government was left with were C91 and C92 without rights and really without a clear financing. So those are my 10 takeaways, and I hope it helps our advocate friends to understand the complexity of the relationship, but also the challenges that advocacy has for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I'd like to thank all of our panelists today, and unfortunately we won't have any time for questions, but I would like to thank the organizers and Eliana for inviting us today. I'd also like to thank the ASL interpreters. I know it's very hard work what they do, so thank you so much for signing for us today. And I hope that all of you have learned a lot about Indigenous languages in Canada. For those of you that this information is new, I hope that you go and learn more about the history and the treatment of Indigenous languages in Canada, and also advocate for improving the language legislation. Miigwech.
Much everyone for this wonderful discussion, and we hope more of it will follow this year as we're approaching the 2022 UNESCO Decade of Indigenous Languages.
LAD 21 proudly supports the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Thank you, panelists. We could not do this without you. See you in 2022. Find us on your favorite social media. Email us at languageadvocacyday@gmail.com or visit languageadvocacyday.ca.